All right, so since the last video, I went ahead and I made a modification, and I went back to finalizing my picture setting at the top so that it would look like this, and we had actually discussed it. So I've got that structural picture. I went ahead and resized it from the last demo, and I decided to keep the vector layer on top that has the blue and drop down to like, I don't know, 29-30% opacity. All right, so that's the original image. That's with the opacity layer on top. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and finish moving other pictures in. And one of the things that I think is going to be really critical in helping us understand more options with Camera Raw is to just experiment with them. So we're going to place a picture here, and then we're going to place a picture here. So let's just go ahead and we're going to find who we are. And so I can go, let's see, actually we're going to find the commercial gallery first. Let's do that one. So I'm going to click on commercial gallery, and we're going to get file place linked. And I'm going to choose the commercial JPEG. All right. And here's what we can do is I'm going to shift option constrain. I'm going to kind of line it right up so it snaps there. And then I'm going to resize it. And it's not quite the right size, but you know, that's okay with me. I'll oversize it a little bit. And then what I'll do is I'll come in and I will do in between these two layers, the commercial and commercial gallery vector. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt on Windows and go ahead, and it will then clip it, put that vector clipping layer on it. And then we're going to do the same thing for residential, and I'll go ahead and do that really fast. All right, so I went ahead and did exactly the same thing as I did for this one. And you know, I actually don't really like the way that these colors look. I think that this needs to pop a little bit more. It needs to be a little bit more graphic and have a little bit more visual interest. And this one needs to be a little bit warmer, I think. But we can do that in Camera Raw and just update it so that it looks right. But real quick, the other thing I want to do is I want to put like a stroke around this, because this white starts to bleed into the white background, and I think having like a sort of a pale gray 1 pixel stroke would be kind of nice. So what I'll do is I'll go over here to I'll go to commercial gallery, and I'm not going to choose the actual image, because remember, the image is clipped inside of something else. What I want to do is choose the vector shape on the bottom, because we're going to put the stroke on the outside, and it needs to be on the outside of the vector shape, because if we put the stroke on the outside of the actual image that's being clipped, then it's going to clip away the stroke that we're trying to show. So we need to put it actually on the clipping mask itself. And what you can do to affect that is down at the bottom of my screen, I'm highlighting the layer styles, and I'm going to click on that. We're going to choose stroke, and it puts this sort of heavy black stroke around it. Let's go ahead and change the color, and let's do something that's much paler. Let's try that, somewhere in that ballpark, and that's a lot better. And it looks, I think that the 1 pixel stroke looks kind of nice, except that positions on inside. We probably want to put it on the outside. And well, I guess inside's probably okay. We'll see how that looks. Now, the thing about this is that looks okay on this picture, but I have a feeling it's going to get lost on the commercial picture, or excuse me, the residential picture, because it has so much more visual information on the borders and boundaries. So let's see what happens if we do this as a 2 pixel stroke. And I think I'm still okay, and with that, I think I can live with that. I hit OK. And then now I have this effect that I want to reproduce and put also on the residential gallery. So what I can do is I can right click in the effect area, and I can say copy layer style. I'm going to collapse that. And then I'm going to choose my residential gallery layer, the vector one, and I'll right click and I will say paste layer style. And then now I've got the stroke on this picture as well. Now, as we said before, I'm going to go and fix these in Camera Raw. So let me go back into Bridge. And here's the commercial, and here's the residential. So let's just start with the commercial. I'll select it and go up to my Camera Raw option, so I'll open that here. And you know, this is a nice picture, but I think I want something that's sort of a little bit more designerly in that I want to pop out certain colors and bring out some of the sort of cyan-y green colors and the red colors so that it just has a little bit more complementary contrast. So anyway, what I'm going to do is first, I guess, is that I'm going to go ahead and look at this basic panel over here. What we had done before is we sort of played around with some of these things up here, but I'm going to just focus on the color correction stuff over here. And I think that I want to warm up the temperature just a smidge a little bit, and you might, I mean, it's this, the changes are kind of subtle until you know, go dramatically one direction or another, and then you can kind of go back down and correct and see where you really want it. So maybe somewhere in there to just warm the picture up a little bit. But then I think I'd like to also increase maybe the contrast a bit. So maybe somewhere in this range. And I think I want to bring out the highlights now too. So what it'll do is it'll sort of blow some of this out. And oops, sorry. If we go down, I don't know, somewhere in this ballpark. And now what's kind of cool that we can do too is we can knock the whites down here. And then you start to pick up all this other visual information in the background so that it's no longer blown out. Okay, so that's pretty cool. All right, so I think I kind of like the way that the white balance changes are. And I think next thing I'd like to do is just, I'll walk you through some of these other options. I don't have a problem with the curves, not so much. Now, if you wanted to look at this histogram up here, there's some things that you could do. Whenever you're looking at a histogram, you always want the darkest tones, the black, which is represented on the left, and the white to always be at least somewhat represented. And for the most part, they kind of are. So if I wanted to drag my histogram over a little bit like this, you can see right down here now pure black is really represented. And if I wanted to drag that over, see, white's already represented, so I don't need to mess with that. But this is a curve setting, which is going to kind of do some of the same stuff that levels will do, but just in a very different way. And you should have experimented with curves several times. I actually don't want to adjust the curves on this, I don't think. And then I don't really feel the need to sharpen anything because I don't want to start to, you know, over-treat this image. I actually kind of like the quality of the image that it is now, but you could sharpen something if it wasn't in detail. And then again, I think I'm going to leave these colors alone a little bit, but you could come in, change the hue, saturation, and the luminance. And I really encourage you though to play around. Like, you know, you could really start to monkey around with these, and you can see maybe slight changes. Like especially notice like up here in the far left pendant light, if I pull the red all the way down, it's very red whenever, and also so is his neck, the skin on his neck. And whenever I pull it all the way up, you can see that it sort of is a lot oranger, but I think I'm going to leave some of these alone, but you can experiment with saturation and so forth. Now I'm going to go into split toning, and I'm going to recommend for this picture, I'm going to recommend that we I'm going to set the hue. Well, first of all, let's just look at saturation, okay? So that when you start to saturate, you can actually see the changes and what's happening with the hues. So right now it's sitting at the red hue, and that's not the one that I actually want to use. So I think that if I don't know, let's just put it somewhere that it's really visible. Pink and like the pinks, the reds, that's not what I really want to do. What I'm more interested in are the greens, and I want to sort of make this a greener image, because if you think about the layout that we have, there's a lot of this blue color, and it has this sort of cyan feel to it, but it also has oranges, and that's kind of what I'm trying to pull out, are like the cyans and the oranges in this image. And so that's sort of where I'm going, and these are the highlights. Okay, now in the shadows, what I want to do is I want to create sort of darker shadows by bringing the saturation up a little bit in sort of the reddish orange range. Okay, and so I think that that starts to give me a really nice quality image. And the other thing is that it makes some of the shadows a lot deeper and more dramatic. And the other thing you can look at, and I'm not going to adjust this because I really like the lens that is on this image, but you could start to distort, you know, the lens. You could fisheye it and so forth. You'd have to go back in and crop if you come in and you go the other direction, sort of more wide angle. But you can also, you know, really start to dramatically affect perspective and things like that. So you can play with this, okay? And you can also do some auto corrections, which I actually don't like what it does to my image, so I'm not going to use these. And then you can look at these other things too. These are more about camera things. We didn't take this picture, so I'm not going to fuss with it too much. And then you have your styles, and of course you can mess with this with grain and so forth. Again, I'm leaving that alone. I encourage you to explore though, so you can see what it does. Now, and the best thing about exploring with these camera raw settings is that it's non-destructive. You can always just go wipe it out, as I showed you in the last demonstration, the last video. So now the other thing is that for camera calibration, I'm going to adjust this. I'm going to play around with this a little bit. So if I come in and I'm primarily interested in kind of seeing what happens with the reds, and you can see that it starts to, my choices here start to make the thing a little bit deeper in kind of in the contrast without actually just doing something simple like adjusting contrast, which doesn't bring out the color in the same way. So I think I'm pretty happy with this, and then I can also show you, like, if you had presets that you wanted to apply that were saved, you could. You can take snapshots also so that you can you know, see different versions of what you're doing. I'm pretty happy with this, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Done. And you can see just even in the thumbnail that it's sort of like this more vivid color here. Now I'm going to go into residential. Well, and first of all, let's take a look in Photoshop and see how that updated. It's updating it, and that's, I think, so much more interesting. But now the image on the right, it needs to be much warmer because if it has sort of more orange tint, it'll be a good contrast to this sort of green cyan type of image. So let's go back into Bridge. We're going to open this residential. Okay, and for this one, you know, this one might be a little bit trickier to adjust because everything, this isn't necessarily the best image. There are parts that are sort of blown out, and there are parts that are very dark. Some of the gammas in between aren't that great. So one of the things immediately I already mentioned that I want to do is I want to warm the temperature of this thing up. So that first thing I'm going to do is just warm it up by pulling up my temperature slider and my white balance. So I think probably everything I'm going to do is mostly going to be in the white balance for this picture. And then, you know, I think that it probably also kind of needs a different kind of contrast. So I'm going to lower the contrast significantly somewhere in this ballpark. And I start to get something different. And then, you know, I can also adjust the shadows because the shadows I feel are, you know, they can be just a little bit more defined. And then, I don't know, let's maybe play around with, I think the clarity is okay. If I wanted to adjust the saturation, you know, I could, but then that starts to really knock it down. That's kind of like overwhelmingly saturated, I think. So I might leave the saturation at 0 because this saturation is pretty significant. Maybe the vibrance can come up a hair. And I think that, and you know, if I do that, you can really dramatically see, but you can also see the histogram up in the top right corner. You can see how that's changing as I drag my slider. So anyway, I think that somewhere in here might be kind of a good place to settle for this image. I'm going to hit done, and then we can go back into Photoshop and see how that updates. And I think that that's a little bit better in terms of being next to this other image. Now, something that's missing is we need a banner kind of thing across that says that this is about commercial and that this one's about residential. I'm going to go ahead and end this video right here though, and we're going to move on in the next one to deal with this plus some of the other image issues.